You were never supposed to hear this story, not in its true form. What the world remembers is a miracle, 4 identical girls born in the shadows of America's depression, a sign, they said, that even in despair, life could still carve wonder out of hardship. But miracles have a way of concealing horrors, and behind the staged photographs of matching dresses, behind the headlines declaring providence, there was a man, a father, whose shadow eclipsed everything. The Blackwood name has been scrubbed from most accounts, buried beneath pseudonyms and sanitized reports. Yet history always leaves residue, the kind that clings like ash to the walls of memory. These 4 sisters would one day be known as the Genain Quadruplets. To science, they were a case study, a cornerstone in the debate over heredity and madness. To their town, they were a curiosity. To their father, they were possessions, identical mirrors to be bent, broken, and reshaped under his hand. Their lives unfolded not in freedom, but under surveillance. A crucible of control where individuality was forbidden and silence became law. Understand this, the story you're about to hear is not about illness alone. It's about power, how institutions, fathers, doctors, and systems of authority conspire to crush the human spirit, then call the wreckage science. The Blackwood sisters were paraded as evidence, their suffering converted into charts and graphs. But beneath the sterile numbers was blood, humiliation, and the kind of psychological torment that does not heal. If you're listening now, you've already crossed the threshold. You've stepped into the shadow corridor where truths are buried, where what passes as progress is revealed as cruelty. The father behind their madness was not alone in his guilt. He was part of something larger, an era drunk on eugenics, obsessed with heredity, intoxicated by the illusion that blood lines could be cleansed, controlled, and rewritten. The sisters' tragedy is not only their own, it is a reflection of the system that devoured them, a system that still whispers through the walls of our institutions today, and by the time you reach the end of this descent, you will not see their story as a relic of the past. You will see it for what it truly is, a warning. To understand the Blackwood sisters' madness, you must first understand their father. He was a man built of contradictions, outwardly strict yet respected, a patriarch who presented himself as a guardian of order, morality, and discipline. But beneath his rigid posture lived a hunger for dominance, for control, for the shaping of life itself according to his vision. In him you see not only the cruelty of one man, but the echo of an entire era's obsession with bending human nature to fit an iron mold. The town remembered him as proud, sometimes charming, always stern. He paraded his daughters like trophies, not children. Their identical faces gave him a kind of power, a stage upon which he could demonstrate his authority. 4 daughters, exact replicas of one another, each expected to move, speak, and behave as though they were one body split into quarters. Any deviation, any spark of individuality, was met with correction, punishment, or shame. In the Blackwood household, difference was treated like sin. This is where the descent began, not with madness inherited, as the doctors later claimed, but with madness imposed. Imagine being born into a mirror you could never escape, your very identity denied to you, because to assert yourself was to defy the architect who ruled over your existence. The sisters were raised not to discover themselves, but to erase themselves. And yet, there's something deeper here. Their father wasn't acting in isolation. He lived in a time when whispers of eugenics infected intellectual circles, when scientists claimed the right to dictate which bloodlines were worth preserving. His obsession with his daughter's conformity mirrored the broader obsession of his age. Control the body, control the mind, and you control the future. The home became the laboratory, the sisters became the experiment, the father became both jailer and God, and each decision he made, whether in the name of discipline, morality, or tradition, tightened the noose around their psyches. Ask yourself, what happens when 4 lives are pressed into one? When the very idea of self is treated as a crime? This was not parenting, it was programming. And as you'll soon see, that programming carved scars so deep that even the world's most celebrated scientists would later mistake those scars for proof of madness. The Blackwood sisters did not inherit their prison. They were born into it, and it wore the face of their father, The first years of a child's life are meant to be soft, filled with warmth, touch, and laughter. But for the Blackwood sisters, infancy was not a sanctuary. It was the beginning of surveillance. Their father treated the nursery like a training ground. Every gesture, every noise, every moment of hunger or discomfort was observed, noted, and corrected. He was not raising children, he was conditioning subjects. Neighbors recalled the girls dressed identically, even as toddlers, lined up in matching clothes, their hair cut to the same length, their movements rehearsed as though they were dolls rather than daughters. Visitors found it eerie, 4 identical children, silent and obedient, staring with wide, unreadable eyes. But to their father, this uniformity was proof of his authority. Each time he erased a difference, each time he stamped out an individual spark, he convinced himself he was bringing order to chaos. There were rules that changed daily, rules impossible to master. One day laughter was forbidden, another day silence was punished. The girls learned quickly that the only path to survival was submission. They lived in anticipation of the next command, their nervous systems wired for fear, their minds taught to fold into themselves. And yet, even in the earliest days, resistance flickered. One sister would cry longer than the others, another would refuse food, another tried to hide, slipping beneath beds or behind doors. These small rebellions were met with swift correction. Punishments were not only physical, they were psychological. He used humiliation as a weapon, turning the sisters against one another, rewarding one for obedience while condemning the others for defiance. It was a strategy of division, a way to fracture solidarity and ensure that no sister could trust the other fully. This was how the father built his kingdom, by instilling the belief that survival required obedience and that individuality was a disease to be rooted out. Science would later call their condition genetic. But ask yourself, what is more powerful, the blood that flows in your veins or the walls that surround you from birth? These girls were not merely shaped by heredity, they were sculpted by an atmosphere of fear so dense it choked the air. The madness of the Blackwood sisters was not born in their minds. It was planted, watered, and harvested within the 4 walls of their childhood home. By the time the Blackwood sisters reached school age, most children would be discovering freedom, playing in dirt, running through fields, scraping their knees in the process of learning who they are. But freedom was a language the sisters were never taught. Their father ensured that the rigidity of the home extended into every corner of their world. School for them was not escape. It was another theater of control. They arrived dressed identically, ribbons pinned at the same angle, shoes polished to the same shine. Teachers whispered about how unnerving it was, 4 children walking into the classroom like carbon copies, their movements rehearsed, their faces blank. Even their handwriting was drilled to match. Letters formed not with creativity, but with mechanical precision. But children are not machines. Beneath the enforced sameness, fractures began to appear. One sister hesitated before answering questions, her voice trembling as though she feared a mistake would echo back home. Another withdrew completely, retreating into silence, her presence shrinking until she seemed almost invisible. A third acted out in bursts of aggression, as though some buried rage demanded release. The fourth tried to please everyone, carrying the crushing weight of perfectionism, convinced that if she held everything together, the punishments would stop. Their father watched these differences closely. He treated them not as signs of individuality, but as flaws in the experiment. He doubled down. Reports from neighbors spoke of endless drills at home, reciting lessons in unison, practicing identical manners at the dinner table, rehearsing scripted responses until no trace of spontaneity remained. And still, rebellion lingered. A sister laughed too loudly one day. Another confessed a secret to a friend. Small cracks. But in the Blackwood household, cracks were dangerous. To him they were threats. Each defiance was punished as though it were betrayal, and betrayal demanded cleansing. This cycle of pressure and punishment etched itself into their minds. Imagine being told, day after day, that your only value lies in vanishing into sameness, that your survival depends on not being seen as yourself. The human spirit resists such conditions, but resistance comes at a cost. For the Blackwood sisters, that cost would be their sanity. Childhood is supposed to be the season of becoming. For them, it became the season of erasure. And in erasing them, their father was not simply controlling his children, he was rehearsing a philosophy that would one day be written into textbooks, labeled as science, and mistaken for truth. Puberty should be a season of awakening, a time when identity sharpens, when children step tentatively toward the edge of adulthood and begin to claim their own reflections. But in the Blackwood household, adolescence was not an awakening, it was a tightening of chains. Their father, already obsessed with sameness, now turned his focus to the transformation of their bodies, and with it, the annihilation of autonomy. He monitored everything: weight, posture, the cut of their hair, the way their dresses fit. Growing curves were not treated as natural signs of womanhood, but as threats to his order. He demanded strict diets, sometimes withholding food, sometimes enforcing overeating, all to ensure the sisters remained aligned in body as well as face. If one bloomed faster than the others, he intervened, adjusting rations or forcing regimens until their development matched. What emerges here is not simply cruelty, but obsession. In the mirror of his daughters, the father saw more than family. He saw property. He saw a stage upon which to perform mastery. Each girl's body was not her own. It was material to be shaped, controlled, and displayed. And adolescence, with its surge of emotions, became the perfect terrain for further domination. When one sister began showing signs of interest in boys at school, he punished her not just with words, but with ritualized humiliation, forcing her to confess her shame before her siblings, branding her individuality as corruption. Another sister, who tried to write secret notes and poems, saw her words torn apart and read aloud as examples of disobedience. Privacy did not exist. Even their diaries were not theirs. But beneath his surveillance, a storm brewed. Their minds, already fractured by years of suppression, now strained under the weight of adolescence. Anxiety became paranoia. Rebellion twisted into self-destruction. Bondsby, between the sisters, already weakened by division, grew toxic. Envy, resentment, and fear colliding in ways none of them could escape. Science would later claim that schizophrenia ran in their bloodline, that their descent into madness was predetermined. But what you see here is not inevitability, it is architecture. Their father built the conditions, he sculpted the stage, and then, when the cracks appeared, society applauded the performance as evidence of heredity. Adolescence could have been the season when the sisters found themselves. Instead, it was when they lost themselves completely. And the architect of their erasure stood smiling, convinced he had fulfilled his role as both father and God. By the time the Blackwood sisters stumbled into adolescence, the fractures within them were too visible to be ignored. Their moods swung wildly: paranoia, depression, bursts of rage, long spells of silence. The townspeople whispered, teachers muttered, neighbors looked away. But where most saw tragedy, the medical world saw opportunity. The doctors came, at first under the guise of concern, then curiosity, and finally, ambition. For what could be more valuable to science than four identical sisters unraveling in unison? To researchers obsessed with heredity, the Blackwoods were not girls at all. They were a living laboratory. Proof, or so they thought, that madness flowed in blood, that nature itself could be dissected, charted, and controlled. The father welcomed them. To him, the attention validated his authority. He paraded his daughters before the white coats like exhibits, allowing strangers to interrogate their minds, prod their bodies, record their behaviors. Every breakdown, every symptom, every humiliation was transformed into data. Notes filled notebooks, observations hardened into diagnoses. The sisters ceased being children and became cases. What the world didn't see, the cruelty behind the numbers, was that the father's control had merely shifted into institutional hands. In the clinic, individuality was no more permitted than it was at home. If one sister spoke differently, doctors wrote of aberrations. If another resisted questioning, it became evidence of pathology. Their humanity dissolved into statistics. And here lies the deepest irony. The very conditions that produced their unraveling, The suffocation, the punishments, the erasure of self were erased from the scientific record. The father's abuse vanished into the margins. Instead, the focus was heredity, genetics, the inevitability of blood. The sisters were weaponized as proof of a theory, a poor, convenient answer for an uncomfortable truth. They did not inherit madness, they inherited a prison, but science, eager for evidence, ignored the prison walls, and once the doctors laid claim to their story, there was no going back. The Blackwood sisters became the Genain Quadruplets, subjects of one of the most famous psychiatric case studies in history. Their suffering was immortalized, but not as truth. Instead, it was embalmed as progress. Their cries became footnotes, their torment graphs, their identities erased one final time. And behind it all, the father stood silent. His hands, which had shaped their torment, were washed clean by the authority of science. In the eyes of history, the blame shifted from him to blood, from cruelty to nature, from crime to inevitability. The clinic was supposed to be a place of care. That's what the reports claimed, that's what the doctors told themselves. But for the Blackwood sisters, it was simply another prison, one colder, more clinical, and perhaps even more cruel than the one at home. Their days were dictated by the rhythm of observation. Wake up, be measured, be weighed, be questioned. Every gesture, every pause, every glance was catalogued as if their very existence could be captured in columns of numbers. Privacy did not exist. Even in the dormitories, orderlies lingered, notebooks in hand. A whispered word between sisters became a data point. A tear shared in silence was logged as symptomatic behavior. Imagine being watched, not for your healing, but for your unraveling. That was the reality of their adolescence, the expectation that they would fracture, that they would perform the very madness the world had already decided was in their blood. And so, in time, they did. Not because heredity demanded it, but because the human spirit collapses when caged and observed without mercy. The doctors weren't monsters in their own eyes. They saw themselves as pioneers, explorers of the human mind. But exploration requires subjects, and subjects, in their logic, did not need dignity, only availability. The sisters were prodded, tested, paraded before visiting scholars as though they were rare specimens. The more they broke, the more valuable they became. The cruelty wasn't always overt. Often it was subtle. A sister who refused to speak was isolated. Another who resisted instructions was written off as hostile. Their father's voice still echoed in the clinic, but now it was amplified by the authority of medicine. Disobedience was no longer just punished. It was pathologized. And once pathologized, it could be dismissed. What no one recorded in the files was the toll it took on their bond. Once mere roars of one another, the sisters began to fracture into roles. The compliant one, the silent one, the angry one, the lost one. They turned against each other, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of desperation. Division, once seeded by their father, now bloomed under the fluorescent gaze of science. The reports declared progress. The charts grew thicker. The case of the Blackwood sisters became famous, a cornerstone in psychiatric literature. But strip away the academic veneer, and you find a haunting truth. Their suffering was not studied to heal, but to confirm what the world already wanted to believe. The clinic was not salvation, it was a theater, and the Blackwood sisters, broken, silent, obedient, were forced to perform. By now, the Blackwood sisters no longer belonged to themselves. They were owned by their father, by the doctors, by the institution that paraded their pain as discovery. Day after day, their sense of self eroded until only fragments remained. And in those fragments, madness took root. Imagine this: 4 girls, identical in face, forced to live as mirrors of one another. Their voices stripped away, their choices denied, their every thought measured by others. What does identity mean when you are never allowed to be you? For the sisters, the answer was terrifying. It meant identity dissolved into confusion, into fear, into competing roles that tore them apart from the inside. One sister tried to cling to compliance. She followed every order, smiled when asked, repeated words as though they belonged to her. But inside, she was hollow. Another retreated into silence, her voice fading until she became a ghost in her own body. A third lashed out violently, her anger the only proof she still existed. The fourth collapsed inward, consumed by despair, convinced that no escape would ever come. The doctors recorded these differences as evidence of pathology, proof that even identical sisters could fracture uniquely under the weight of illness. What they ignored was that the fractures were not symptoms of heredity, but symptoms of erasure. When individuality is crushed, the soul doesn't vanish, it mutates. It bends in unnatural shapes, each distortion a desperate attempt to survive. The sisters no longer trusted one another. Their father had planted division long ago, but now it spread like infection. They began to fear each other's outbursts, resent each other's compliance, envy each other's moments of reprieve. What should have been solidarity dissolved into suspicion, and with suspicion came isolation, the cruelest condition of all. This was the genius of their father's experiment, though he may never have named it so. By denying them individuality, by binding them as a unit yet forcing them to fracture internally, he created the perfect paradox: 4 lives trapped in sameness, yet alone in their suffering. Madness did not appear as lightning from the sky. It seeped slowly like water into stone, each day another crack, each month another fragment lost. Until finally, the sisters began to believe what the world already said of them, that they were not victims, but proof, not daughters, but data, not people, but pathology. And once you accept the lie they built around you, your soul begins to dissolve. There comes a point in every descent when the boundary between victim and witness begins to blur. As you hear their story, you begin to feel the weight of their silence pressing against your own chest. The Blackwood sisters had reached that point. They were no longer 4 children. They were 4 shadows moving through hallways, watched, recorded, dissected, and slowly erased. But here's the unsettling truth. What destroyed them was not only their father, not only the doctors. It was the silence of everyone else, the neighbors who whispered but never intervened, the teachers who saw the signs but turned away, the scientists who wrote reports while ignoring the screams between the lines. Silence is never neutral, it is complicity, and in the case of the Blackwood sisters, it was a death sentence stretched across decades. This is where I ask you, the listener, to pause, because history is not just something that happened, it is something that is happening. The systems that caged the Blackwood sisters still exist, dressed in new words, hidden under new names, and if you have followed me this far, you are no longer a passive witness. You are inside the corridor with them. So here is the phrase that locks you into this descent. Write it in the comments, and let it mark you as one who has crossed the threshold. I hear the silence. Type it, and you will feel the shift. For those who have not reached this depth, it will mean nothing. But for those who have followed, it is a confession. It is proof that you understand what silence does, that you recognize it not as absence, but as a weapon. The sisters lived their entire lives trapped in the silence of others, every laugh stifled, every protest crushed, every cry ignored, and in time they began to believe silence was all they were worth. That is how control works. It convinces you that your own voice is mean, English. But their story is not finished, and neither is yours. To hear the silence is to recognize the chains, and once you recognize them, you cannot unsee them. Adulthood is supposed to bring choice, independence, a chance to step outside the shadow of childhood and shape your own life. For the Blackwood sisters, adulthood offered no such escape. If anything, their chains only tightened. By the time they reached their 20s, the sisters had become fixtures of psychiatric literature. They were no longer treated as women with futures, but as cases, objects of fascination for scholars, psychiatrists, and medical students. Every decision about their lives was made by someone else: where they lived, what work they could attempt, who they could speak to. Their humanity remained suspended in the same sterile frame that had defined their childhood: observation without liberation. The father still hovered in the background, his authority lingering like smoke long after he was gone. His rules had been replaced by institutional ones, but the spirit was the same: obedience, sameness, control. The sisters were shuffled into supervised housing, their days structured not around desire, but around management. If one wanted to explore beyond the walls, the request was denied. If another showed signs of independence, it was treated as instability. Their lives had become an endless cycle of permission and denial, never autonomy. And the cruelest part, the outside world knew their names, yet not their souls. Newspaper articles, academic studies, whispered lectures, all spoke of them as the Genain Quadruplets, as if that label explained everything. They were reduced to a headline, a genetic mystery, a medical curiosity. Few ever asked what it meant to be them, to live in a body that was not yours, to carry an identity you never chose. In adulthood, some sisters tried to resist. One attempted relationships, desperate for connection. Another sought escape in writing, filling pages with words that no one else would ever read. These flickers of humanity were quickly extinguished by the weight of stigma and supervision. Even their attempts at love were pathologized, treated as symptoms rather than longing. And so adulthood, instead of breaking the cycle, simply extended it. Their youth had been stolen by a father obsessed with control. Their adulthood was stolen by a society obsessed with explanation. Both cages looked different, but both were built on the same foundation, stripping 4 women of the right to be human. The tragedy of the Blackwood sisters is not that they were studied. It is that they were never allowed to live. The house was full, yet hollow. Every corner of the Blackwell mansion seemed to whisper of absence, like a stage set after the actors had fled. Servants walked on edge, avoiding eye contact, their footsteps muffled as if afraid to disturb something that lingered unseen. At the heart of it all stood a single object that no one dared touch, the cradle. It had once rocked with laughter and fragile breaths, a symbol of continuity and legacy. Now, it was an accusation. Its polished wood gleamed, but inside there was only emptiness, lined with lace that had grown stiff with disuse. Some swore they saw the cradle move on its own, a faint sway, as though invisible hands still rocked it. Others whispered of hearing faint coos, a baby's sigh that could not possibly exist. For Catherine, the cradle was unbearable. She avoided the nursery, yet was drawn to it in restless nights, her pale figure drifting toward that room like a moth to a flame. Her fingers traced the wood as if searching for warmth that was long gone. Her lips trembled with words she never spoke aloud. "Forgive me," she would whisper into the dark, but to whom no one could tell. Jonathan, by contrast, locked the nursery door. He commanded that it remain shut, as if walls could bury what conscience could not. Yet in his solitude he too heard it, the creak of the cradle swaying, slow and deliberate, as though mocking him. The cradle had become the family's mirror, an object that reflected not the child who was gone, but the truth they refused to face. Each night it stood waiting, polished and perfect, a hollow shrine to the life that never grew old. The Blackwells could silence their servants. They could dismiss the townspeople. They could even hide behind locked doors and shuttered windows. But the cradle, they could not silence that. It was not just a reminder of what was missing. It was a reminder of what they had done. At night, the Blackwell mansion became a labyrinth of whispers. The walls themselves seemed alive, carrying voices that no servant admitted to speaking. Sometimes it was a lullaby, faint and broken, like a mother humming from another room. Other times it was the soft murmur of children at play, running just beyond sight, their laughter echoing down corridors that had long been empty. Catherine was the first to confess what she heard. Sitting alone in the drawing room, she would freeze, her glass trembling in her hand as faint giggles floated through the plaster. She swore she heard her daughter's name, spoken in a child's breathy tone, as though called from behind the wallpaper. Jonathan dismissed it as grief, but his eyes betrayed him. More than once he startled at the sound of footsteps pattering across the nursery above them, a room locked and forbidden. When he climbed the staircase to prove himself right, he found nothing. No servant, no child. Only the locked nursery door, and silence so suffocating it felt deliberate. The servants, too, whispered among themselves. They claimed the mansion's walls absorbed sorrow like a sponge, now dripping it back as sound. They said the house itself had grown aware, repeating the voices of the children it had swallowed. Some even claimed they had seen faint handprints in the dust, tiny, perfect, pressed against the walls as if from the inside out. At dinner, the family sat in silence, forks scraping china, each one pretending not to hear the murmurs seeping through the walls around them. But when the chandelier above began to sway, though no wind stirred, the illusion of denial cracked. Catherine wept. Jonathan rose in fury, pounding the table, declaring that walls could not speak. But the house disagreed. That very night, as Jonathan drifted into uneasy sleep, the walls around his bed shivered and breathed. And in the hush, before dawn, a child's voice whispered from the plaster, clear, undeniable and cruel. "Papa, why did you leave us?" The voices no longer hid in the wallpaper. By the turn of autumn they had grown bolder, sharper and crueler. What began as faint echoes of children's laughter became barbed accusations, spoken in tones that could no longer be mistaken for memory. Catherine woke one night to a chorus of whispers circling her bed, as though unseen mouths pressed close to her ears. "You failed us." The words slithered through her like venom. She bolted upright, clutching the sheets to her chest, but the voices did not stop. "You looked away. You let him hurt us." She screamed, waking Jonathan, who sat up with fury in his eyes. But even as he tried to dismiss it as her hysteria, his own torment had begun. Down in his study, where he sought solace in brandy and books, the voices struck him too. They spoke in perfect unison, the 4 children he once claimed as his own. "Father, why do you drink while we rot? Father, do you remember the straps, the fists? Father, we carry your madness in our blood." Jonathan's hand trembled as he lifted the glass. He smashed it against the fireplace, roaring at the shadows, but the voices only laughed. For the first time he felt small in his own home, a trespasser in a place he thought he commanded. The servants began to quit. They claimed the house spoke to them as well, naming their sins aloud as they scrubbed the floors. One maid swore the voice of a little girl asked her why she had drowned her bastard child in secret. Another footman fled into the night after hearing a boy's voice whispering the very date his mother would die. With each departure, the mansion grew quieter of human life, but louder of something else. The Blackwells found themselves alone with the voices, hemmed in on all sides by grief turned malignant. And as the whispers pressed harder, the tone shifted. No longer did they merely accuse. They began to command. "Pay what is owed. Bring us back. Blood for blood." The whispers no longer lingered like echoes. They struck like orders. Each night the mansion's air grew heavy, as though the very beams and stone conspired against the Blackwells. The voices had ceased weeping. Now they hungered. Catherine was the first to yield to their weight. One evening, while kneeling before her vanity, she saw words scrawled across the mirror in a trembling child's hand. The glass fogged, through the fire burned low, and there in letters drawn as if by unseen fingers appeared the words, "Give us what was taken." She screamed for Jonathan, but when he stormed into the room, the letters remained, etched in frost that did not melt. His face paled, though he spat denial. Yet as he turned from the mirror, his reflection lagged a moment behind, its mouth still whispering the phrase. Servants spoke of blood seeping between the floorboards in the abandoned nursery, though none dared open the locked door. At night, small shadows roamed the halls, darting at the edge of lamplight. Catherine swore she felt a child's hand slip into hers in the dark, only to vanish when she grasped it. Jonathan, once the tyrant, now found himself broken. The voices demanded restitution. "Return what you stole, father. Flesh for flesh." He drowned their cries in liquor until the drink betrayed him, twisting his sight, making him stumble through corridors where the wallpaper bulged with the impression of faces pressing from the other side. One night, the whispers changed. They no longer spoke as children, but as something older, deeper. A single low chorus vibrated through the walls like the groan of earth shifting. "The debt is not only yours, Jonathan, it belongs to your blood. Pay, or we shall take." Catherine wept, clutching her rosary until the beads snapped. Jonathan slammed his fists against the nursery door, roaring that he would not bow, that no ghost, no devil, no memory could command him. But from within the nursery, 4 voices answered in perfect unison, calm, cold, and patient. "Then we will come to collect. The locked nursery, once silent behind its heavy oak door, began to breathe. At first it was subtle, the faint creak of floorboards shifting as if small feet paced within. Then came the scratching, like nails tracing across wood, persistent, rhythmic, waiting. Jonathan ordered the servants to ignore it, but they could not. By dusk the scratching grew into pounding, small fists striking the door in perfect unison. It echoed down the hall, rattling chandeliers and stirring dust from the rafters. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath each time the pounding ceased, only to shudder when it began again. One night, Catherine approached the door, trembling with candlelight in hand. She pressed her ear against the wood. At first, there was silence. Then, soft, unmistakable, 4 voices whispered her name, not in anger, not in accusation, but in longing. "Mama." Her knees buckled. She dropped the candle, flames snuffing out as it rolled across the carpet. Jonathan dragged her away, his face twisted in terror though he called her weak. Yet when night fell again, he too was drawn to the door. Drunk and staggering, he demanded the voices face him. He cursed his children, cursed the house, cursed God himself. The reply was not words, but sound. A single toy, an old wooden horse once belonging to one of the girls, slid out from beneath the nursery door, its wheels squeaking across the floorboards. Jonathan stared, frozen, as the toy circled his boots before coming to rest at his feet. The servants fled the next morning. Not one returned. The Blackwells were alone now, trapped within the mansion with the nursery that no longer slept. At night, the door rattled on its hinges, as though something inside tested its strength. And though Jonathan swore it would never open, Catherine whispered in her prayers that she feared the opposite. Because some nights, when the pounding grew wild and frenzied, when the voices rose into shrieks that clawed at her bones, Catherine swore she saw the nursery door breathing, its frame swelling and contracting like the chest of a living thing. And the air that leaked through its cracks was no longer stale but warm. It happened on a night of storm. The winds clawed at the shutters, rain lashed the stone walls, and the Blackwell mansion groaned as though the storm itself had taken residence within. But the true violence came not from the sky, it came from the nursery. The pounding began at midnight, harder than ever before. The oak door shook in its frame, dust falling from the ceiling with each blow. Catherine clung to her bed, sobbing, while Jonathan staggered into the hall, pistol in hand, swearing he would end this torment once and for all. When he reached the nursery, the door no longer rattled, it breathed. The wood expanded and contracted, as if lungs swelled behind it. Then, with a splintering crack, the lock snapped. Slowly, inch by inch, the door creaked open. The air that poured out was heavy and sweet, like spoiled fruit left to rot. The candle Jonathan carried flickered violently, nearly extinguished by a gust that smelled of damp earth. And from the darkness within, toys began to roll into the hallway, blocks, dolls, a skipping rope, all coated in dust yet strangely warm to the touch. Catherine, drawn by both terror and compulsion, crept behind her husband. She swore she saw shadows moving just beyond the threshold, small darting shapes that giggled in voices too faint to catch. Her heart leapt into her throat. Jonathan raised his pistol, hands shaking. "Show yourselves," he roared. His words echoed through the hall, but the house answered first. From within the nursery, the 4 voices rose together, soft as lullabies, steady as ritual. "We are waiting, Father." And then, silence. The door stood wide enough for a man to pass through, darkness yawning beyond. Jonathan's candle trembled, its light unable to pierce the gloom. It was not the absence of light, but the presence of something thicker, swallowing it whole. Jonathan stepped forward, jaw clenched, pistol raised. Catherine reached for him, screaming his name, but he ignored her. With one final curse, he crossed the threshold into the nursery. The door slammed shut. Catherine's scream tore through the hall, but the house swallowed it whole. The slam echoed like a gunshot, rattling every picture frame along the corridor. Catherine hurled herself against the nursery door, pounding with her fists until her skin split. "Jonathan! Jonathan!" she shrieked, but the wood was cold, unyielding. At first, there was silence. Then came the sounds. A shuffle of small feet. A chair sliding across the floor. The faint musical creak of a child's rocking horse. Catherine pressed her ear to the door, trembling so hard she thought her bones would rattle apart. What she heard next froze her blood. It was Jonathan's voice, ragged, furious. He bellowed, cursed, demanded obedience as he had so many times before. But the voices that answered were not obedient. They were calm, childish, cruel. "Sit down, father. It is your turn. Be still, or we will make you." Jonathan roared back, the sound of his boots stomping against the floorboards. Then came a crash. The pistol fired, deafening in its closeness. Catherine screamed, clawing at the handle, but the door would not budge. Then, silence. A long, dreadful silence, so deep it seemed to stretch across eternity. Catherine pressed her face against the crack of the door, her breath fogging the wood. Finally, a sound drifted through. Jonathan's voice, but it was different now. Weak, pleading. "Please, no more." And then, in unison, 4 high, bright voices rose, reciting words she did not understand. Not prayer, not rhyme, but something older, colder. The cadence was ritual. The rocking horse squeaked, rocking faster and faster, until it stopped abruptly. Jonathan screamed, a scream so raw and animal it did not sound human. Catherine reeled back, hands clamped over her ears, but still she heard it. Then silence fell again. And finally, in the faintest whisper came the children's chorus, sickly sweet, mocking, "Good night, father." The door unlatched itself with a soft click. The latch slid free, but the door did not swing open. It drifted slowly, deliberately, as though pushed by small unseen hands. Catherine staggered back, her heart a hammer against her ribs, as the blackness of the nursery gaped before her. The air that seeped out was heavy, cloying, thick with the scent of damp earth and iron. Her candle sputtered, flame nearly suffocated by the darkness. For a moment she could see nothing, then her eyes adjusted. The nursery had not been abandoned. Toys lay scattered across the floor, but they were not as she remembered. Dolls sat upright in neat rows, their glassy eyes fixed upon her. Blocks were stacked into towers, each carved with symbols she could not recall buying. A skipping rope swung lazily from the ceiling beam, though no hand held it. And in the center of the room stood Jonathan, or what remained of him. He was on his knees, head bowed, arms hanging limp at his sides. His pistol lay twisted in the corner, the barrel bent as though crushed by invisible hands. His shirt clung wet to his body, dark with stains. Yet it was his face that hollowed Catherine's soul. His eyes were wide, blank, unfocused, lips moving silently as though repeating words he could not stop. Around him circled the shadows, 4 small shapes, darting and weaving, their outlines flickering like candle flames. At times they seemed like children, slender arms, long hair, quick steps. At others their forms stretched too tall, their limbs bending wrong, their faces nothing but blur. Catherine gasped. One of the figures turned toward her. Though faceless, she felt its gaze pierce her marrow. A child's giggle broke the silence, high and sharp, echoing far longer than it should have. Jonathan lifted his head then, and for the first time in months, his voice carried no fury, only terror. "Don't let them take me." But the figures laughed again, a chorus. Of voices not only of children, but of something older, deeper. The dolls on the shelves toppled one by one, their porcelain heads cracking against the floor. The skipping rope twisted tighter around the beam, swinging violently, though no hand pulled it. Catherine screamed his name. Jonathan did not answer. The shadows closed in. Catherine surged forward, skirts tangling around her legs, throat raw from screaming. She grabbed Jonathan's shoulders, shaking him with all the strength terror lent her. His skin was cold, clammy, as if he had been kneeling there for hours, though mere minutes had passed. "Jonathan, get up," she begged, dragging at his arm. His body shifted, but did not rise. His weight was monstrous, as though the nursery itself pressed him into the floor. The shadows darted closer. One brushed against her arm, and a chill like ice seared through her flesh. She recoiled, gasping, the skin already pale as bone where it had touched her. Above, the skipping rope swung harder, creaking like a pendulum counting down time. Jonathan's lips moved, his voice barely a whisper. "They won't let me go." Catherine clawed at him, desperate, sobbing. She tried to drag him toward the door, inch by inch, her body straining. For a moment she believed she could succeed. His boots scraped against the floorboards, his head lolled against her shoulder. Then the door slammed shut behind her. The sound reverberated like a coffin-lid ceiling. Her candle died, plunging the room into darkness lit only by flashes of lightning through the cracked shutters. From every corner, the toys began to move. The dolls' heads turned toward her, eyes glinting in the dark. The blocks tumbled, rearranging themselves into words she could barely see in the lightning's flicker. "Stay." The rocking horse shuddered forward on its own, its painted smile grotesque in the half-light. Catherine shrieked and pulled harder on Jonathan, but his body stiffened, his jaw snapping shut as if locked by unseen force. His eyes rolled back, showing only white. The shadows pressed close, whispering in voices that multiplied, overlapping, filling the room until it was deafening. "He is ours. He is owed, and so are you." Catherine froze, blood running cold. The nursery was not only a prison, it was a mouth, and it had not yet fed enough. The whispers grew teeth. They no longer circled the edges of the room, but pressed directly into Catherine's ears, filling her skull until she thought her mind would split. Her hands trembled violently as she clutched Jonathan, but he was dead weight now, his head slumped forward, lips moving soundlessly, eyes fixed on nothing. The air thickened, heavy as water, every breath a drowning. Catherine felt her knees buckle. The dolls slid closer across the floor, scraping in unison, forming a half-circle around her and Jonathan. Their tiny porcelain mouths cracked open, and from them poured the same chorus as the shadows. "Stay. Pay. Ours." The rope above her snapped taut with a crack. It swung down like a serpent, coiling toward her neck. Catherine screamed and fell back, dragging Jonathan with her. Lightning flashed through the window, and in that searing light she saw them, 4 children. They stood around Jonathan now, small hands laid upon his shoulders, his chest, his bowed head. Their faces flickered between familiar and grotesque. At one moment they were her daughters, pale and fragile, eyes wide with sorrow. The next, their jaws stretched too wide, their eyes hollow pits of black. "Release him," Catherine cried, clutching the crucifix at her neck, pressing it forward with shaking hands. For a heartbeat the children faltered. Their outlines flickered, their voices stuttered. Catherine's hope flared. She thrust the crucifix higher, her lips stumbling over prayer. But the shadows only laughed. The crucifix cracked in her hands, splintering into pieces that fell like ash. The laughter swelled until the nursery shook, toys bouncing against the walls, the rope writhing above. Jonathan's head snapped up suddenly, his eyes glowing with a dull, unnatural light, his mouth stretched into a grin that was not his own. "We are all still here, Catherine," he whispered, in a voice layered with 4 others. "And now, you are too." The rope coiled tight around her wrist, yanking her toward the center of the room. The dolls clattered closer, their cracked faces grinning wide. The nursery had chosen. It would not let her leave. The rope burned into Catherine's wrist, pulling her inch by inch toward the center of the nursery. She screamed, twisting, clawing at the floorboards, but the wood splintered beneath her nails as though the house itself rejected her escape. The dolls clattered forward, their porcelain jaws chattering in mock laughter. Jonathan's body shuddered upright, though Catherine could see he did not move of his own will. His limbs jerked like a puppet's, pulled by unseen strings. His glowing eyes fixed on her, and his lips curled into that terrible, borrowed smile. "Stay, Catherine," he crooned, though the words were not his. "We are a family again." Her mind buckled under the weight of it, the room swarming with shadows, the rope coiling tighter, the toys closing in. But something deep within her, primal and desperate, clawed upward. A voice not of terror, but of defiance. She wrenched her free hand toward the floor and seized the fallen pistol. It was bent, ruined, but not entirely. Trembling, she cocked the hammer back with her thumb. The shadows shrieked, recoiling for the first time. The children's forms flickered, their chorus breaking. Catherine pressed the pistol beneath Jonathan's chin. Tears blurred her vision, but her hand was steady. "Forgive me," she whispered, not to him, but to the man he had once been, long before the madness, long before the house claimed him. The nursery roared in fury. The rope lashed violently, tightening around her arm. The children screamed, their voices rattling the very walls. She pulled the trigger. The gunshot tore through the house like thunder. Jonathan collapsed instantly, the glow vanishing from his eyes, his body slack and lifeless. For a heartbeat, silence followed. Then the shadows howled. The rope recoiled, snapping back toward the ceiling. The dolls cracked, porcelain shattering into dust. The children's outlines dissolve, Ed shrieking as though dragged into some unseen maw. The nursery walls bulged outward, then caved inward, trembling with rage. Catherine dropped the pistol and crawled toward the door. It flew open on its own, the house vomiting her out into the hall. She slammed it shut behind her, chest heaving, blood streaking her wrist where the rope had burned her. And though the hall fell silent, the nursery door pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat before going still. Catherine knew then, she had not won. She had only been spared. The house was silent. Too silent. Catherine staggered down the hall, her breath ragged, her skirts torn and soaked with sweat. Behind her, the nursery door stood shut, but she could still feel it breathing. Each step she took seemed to echo louder than it should, as though the walls were listening, waiting. Jonathan's blood was on her hands. It smeared her palms, soaked into the lace at her cuffs. She tried to wipe it away, but no matter how furiously she scrubbed against her gown, the stain only spread. Her husband's face flashed in her mind, the glow in his eyes, the grin that wasn't his, the way his body slumped when the shot rang out. She told herself she had freed him, but the truth gnawed like a rat in her skull. She had given the house what it wanted. By dawn, the servants who had fled crept back to the grounds, drawn by curiosity or pity. They found Catherine pacing the great hall barefoot, her eyes wide and unblinking, whispering to herself. When they tried to approach, she shrieked, clutching her burned wrist as though it still bore the rope. She refused to leave the mansion. No coaxing, no pleading could drag her across its threshold. "If I go, they will follow," she muttered. "If I go, they'll come into the world." So she stayed, wandering the corridors with a candle, listening, always listening for the nursery's pulse. At night she heard it, the faint shuffle of small feet above, a giggle down the stairwell. Sometimes, in the darkness, a child's voice cooed softly, "Mama." When the servants begged her to burn the nursery, Catherine only shook her head. "You cannot burn what is already alive," she whispered. "You cannot kill what feeds." The house grew colder. One by one, the servants left again, this time for good. By winter's first frost, Catherine was alone, just as the nursery wanted. And when the first snowfall blanketed the grounds, neighbors claimed they saw candlelight flickering in every window of the Blackwell mansion. 4 silhouettes danced across the curtains of the upper rooms, but the house had only one living occupant. The night after Samuel's exhumation, the town fell under a suffocating silence. Not even the dogs barked, and the church bell, though untouched, let out a faint metallic hum that carried through the cold air. In the center of the square, the coffin lay, its lid forced open, the boy's body exposed. Yet when people looked closer, they swore it did not resemble a corpse. His lips seemed moist, as if recently wetted. His eyes, though closed, trembled faintly, as though fluttering beneath the lids in a restless dream. A woman fainted upon seeing his small hand twitch. Others screamed that the devil had taken root in his veins. The priest raised a trembling cross, but the air bent around it, making the metal glow as though resisting his grip. By dawn, Samuel's body was gone. Some claimed he walked into the woods on his own 2 feet, leaving small barefoot prints in the frost. Others whispered the townsfolk themselves carried him there, desperate to hide what they could no longer explain. The truth, as with all things about Samuel Blackwood, was buried in fear, rumor, and silence. But one fact remained. The boy who should never have lived, who should never have been, was no longer where they left him. And from that moment, the entire town of Cold Harbor began to rot, from its wells, its crops, even the children born after. It was not Samuel they had buried. It was their last chance at mercy, By winter's end, Cold Harbor was no longer a town. It was a graveyard with a few breathing souls left to count its sins. The wells turned bitter and black. Animals birthed stillborn litters, and mothers whispered their newborns carried Samuel's silence in their blood. Houses were abandoned overnight, their doors swinging open in the wind, as though the occupants had simply vanished mid-supper. The church, the heart of Cold Harbor, stood locked. The priest who once defied Samuel was found kneeling before the altar, his head bowed as if in prayer. Only when someone dared approach did they realize his chest had been hollowed out, the cavity filled with wet soil and roots. No one claimed his body, no one buried him. Stories spread faster than the plague that now lingered in the air. Samuel's name was never spoken aloud, but scratched into wood, carved into doors, or muttered in fevered dreams. Some swore his shadow moved through the trees at night, not as a boy but as something stretched, thin and monstrous, carrying the face of a child, but the hunger of a god. By spring, only a handful remained. They gathered in the square, begging one another for answers, for hope, for any proof that their punishment was nearly done. But then came the truth none wanted to face. This was not punishment, this was inheritance. Samuel was not a curse placed upon Cold Harbor. Samuel was Cold Harbor's creation, its secret, its shame, its mirror. And now he had returned, not to be remembered, but to be obeyed. The last night in Cold Harbor arrived without warning. The sky had no stars, only a thick velvet blackness that seemed to press down upon the earth. The few who remained gathered in their homes, candles burning low, whispering prayers they no longer believed in. Then came the sound, soft at first, like a child humming. It spread through the streets, slipping under doors, crawling into ears, until every living soul recognized it. Samuel's lullaby, the same tune his mother had sung before she too vanished into the soil. One by one, the candles extinguished, not from wind, but as though the flames themselves recoiled in terror. In the suffocating dark, the survivors felt something rise beneath their feet. The ground trembled, not an earthquake, but a stirring. The earth groaned, and from it came hands, small hands, countless hands. The children Cold Harbor had buried, forgotten, erased, digging themselves free. Their faces pale, their eyes hollow, yet each wearing Samuel's silence. When dawn finally broke, Cold Harbor no longer existed. Its houses had collapsed into the ground as if swallowed whole. The wells, the church, the streets, all erased, leaving only churned soil. No records were kept, no map marked its place. Travelers who passed through swore they heard whispers in the wind, the faint echo of a child's hum. Samuel Blackwood was never found. Some say he walked into the woods that night, taking his siblings, born and unborn, with him. Others insist he became the soil itself, feeding on every root and stone, waiting for another town foolish enough to forget what it buried. Cold Harbor's fate became a cautionary tale spoken in hushed tones. The boy science couldn't explain. The boy, a town tried to erase, had never been a boy at all. And if you find yourself walking through a forest where the earth feels soft and unsteady beneath your feet, stop, listen. If you hear a lullaby, it is already too late.